Thank you for the invitation to speak. Actually, before I start on this, I would just like to say a couple of words about the US book on Chernobyl. To get to the figure of 980,000 early deaths from Chernobyl, it makes what to my mind is a quite extraordinary assumption, which is that Chernobyl was the only important event with health consequences that's happened in the last 25 years. And so every increase in any type of disease in the region through that period of time must be caused by Chernobyl. This is the only study which has taken that assumption, because to get to that assumption you have to ascribe a whole series of diseases, including things like alcoholism and suicide, to radiation. And these are not things that, for example, were seen in the populations after Hiroshima and Nagasaki or any other irradiated population in the world. And it's very interesting that the publishers of the book have now in effect disowned it and said it was a mistake to publish that book. The other thing you need to believe, if you believe the figure of 980,000, is that the World Health Organization, which is not the International Atomic Energy Agency, it's an entirely separate organization, and the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSCEAR, which again is a separate organization both from the World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency, have been involved in the biggest health cover-up that the world has ever seen. It might be the case, but I frankly don't believe it, both because the World Health Organization's remit has nothing to do directly with radiation, and it certainly doesn't have the balanced role, or rather does have a much more balanced role than the International Atomic Energy Agency, which for historical reasons has been a body that promotes nuclear energy as part of its remit. And frankly, given that the latest World Health Organization and UNSCEAR studies published last year, the 2010 update of Chernobyl, make it very clear that although the radiation-related consequences of Chernobyl are very limited basically to some effects among those who were on site at the time, including, sadly, those who died as a direct result within 30 days of the accident itself, something of the order of 6,000 or 7,000 cases of thyroid cancer, which are certainly the result of the accident and could easily have been avoided had the Soviets been as effective as, for example, the Japanese were 3 months ago in distributing iodine tablets. Some cases of cataracts among those who were involved on site, and that again is established as a radiation-related disease. But the real death toll from Chernobyl has been because of the stress-related diseases, which do include the alcoholism, do include suicides, which, coupled with the general collapse of the Soviet Union at the time, have meant that, in effect, it's most of the health consequences have been far more associated with those who, for whatever political reasons, have over-exaggerated the effects of the accident than have actually been associated with the radiation itself. And I think it's very unfortunate that a relatively small number of individuals, but nonetheless a number of individuals have good contacts with the media, have got themselves into a position to be able to contribute to those stress-related illnesses in a population which has been very severely devastated by the collapse of the economy in the late 1980s and all of the problems with malnutrition, with collapse of social order, and the only part of the world that actually saw life expectancy falling in that period of time, and have chosen almost randomly to ascribe all of those effects to a single industrial accident. And I think I would say anybody who is tempted to quote that book should look very carefully as to why this single book should be right, while all of the enormous weight of respectable independent scientific evidence that's been carried out in the area shows something very, very different indeed. However, I just wanted to touch on those. The thing I'd like to cover in the course of the next few minutes is just one or two personal reflections on what we might be able to learn from Fukushima in terms of the way that we can deal with major accidents and communication in such a way that doesn't exacerbate levels of concern beyond the quite understandable and correct levels of concern that a major incident would involve anyway. Briefly, Christine mentioned at the beginning that the levels or the ways that fuel or electricity is generated in Hong Kong is not necessarily well known by people. There's no reason why it should be, quite frankly. As long as the electricity is coming out of the wall, that's pretty much all most of us need. But at the moment, it's dominated by coal, producing just over half the total, with the rest of it being pretty much exactly balanced between nuclear and gas. Hong Kong imports 99.5% of its energy requirements. That's, by definition, pretty much the highest percentage in the world because you can't go much further than that. The plans published in 2010 for the year 2020 suggested that because of concerns about climate change, and goodness me, I do sometimes fear for my sister's children and what sort of world they're going to inherit. But it's climate change that really frightens me rather than any other of the environmental issues that we face at the moment. The switch around towards nuclear and increasing proportion of gas, which is much cleaner than coal, with some development of renewables and some coal continuing, are what's projected for the future. It's usually said that we need three things from our electricity supplies, which are secure supplies. Power cuts are enormously expensive, both in economic terms and in social terms. You get looting, you get breakdown of social order. Incidentally, one of the effects of the 1977 power cut in New York was that 9 months later there was a significant spike in the birth rate. So there can be some interesting consequences of major power outages. We want economic supplies. Doesn't necessarily mean that we want cheap prices, because we might decide for policy reasons that we want high prices to keep people's focus on using energy effectively and efficiently. But there's no point in having sources that are very expensive to generate in the first place. That will lead to considerable damage to people's health, for example, because of resources that aren't available for use for healthcare and so on. And supplies that are environmentally acceptable. And that can involve climate change, it can involve visual intrusion or interference with water supplies, with renewables, it can involve radioactive emissions and so on. But let's not lose sight of the fact that there is a fourth requirement, and that is that energy and electricity must be politically and socially acceptable. And actually, in terms of the history of nuclear energy, the political issue has been just as important as any of the others, both directly in terms of policy decisions, but indirectly because of pushing up the costs of nuclear electricity through heavier regulation, which in itself is expensive, and what, to my view, has involved over-engineering of safety standards. In 6 OECD countries between 1978 and 2001, there were some 25 nuclear plants closed, not for safety or economic reasons, but because of political decisions, quite often after referenda. Several countries introduced phase-out policies around that time in the 1980s and 1990s. Several other countries which didn't have nuclear power put policy obstacles or legal obstacles into the way of developing new nuclear plants within their countries. In terms of a few things about public perceptions of nuclear energy, firstly, it is very much a back-of-mind issue. I'm always fascinated as to what sort of literacy about nuclear energy actually means, because in our lives we probably have 50 or 60 quite complex issues. That's a guess, it might be significantly more than that. The idea that any population can be sufficiently well informed about every one of those issues to be able to come to an independent view, I think is simply unrealistic. Most of what goes on in the world, I haven't the faintest idea why it works or how it goes about its business. And most of those things enrich my life enormously. I quite honestly cannot start to explain to you how an iPod works, or particularly how a waterproof iPod works. I just know that my daily swim would be enormously less pleasurable if somebody didn't know how to make a waterproof iPod work. Energy, I think, broadly is in that same overall category. So it's both unrealistic and almost a bit arrogant of the nuclear industry to imagine that the population should be totally au fait with nuclear power. I have to say, I'm coming up to 25 years of having been observing nuclear energy, 8 years from the Atomic Energy Authority in the UK, and then the rest of it as an academic. It's only in the last 3 months that I've really begun to understand how a boiling water reactor, Mark I, actually works. Because we've never had them in Europe. I had no particular reason to understand that. And so at the beginning of the process, my learning curve was pretty much vertical when I was having to go onto the media and to explain these things without having the faintest idea about it myself. I got there, broadly speaking, but the idea that the whole population can get to that level of understanding is just simply a non-starter, nor, I believe, is it necessary. My impression is that most people who do think about nuclear energy, and I say people don't terribly much, feel a kind of unease about it, but broadly are quite realistic in recognising there are no easy answers in energy. In terms of some of the unease, I won't go through these for a matter of time, but I think the industry itself has contributed to a lot of it through its own arrogance, through its secrecy, through its talking down to people, and particularly through seeming to be obsessed by the machines rather than talking about people. That they're very proud of their big machines, the boys who invented nuclear power, probably rightly so, but I don't support nuclear power because I like the machines. My belief about nuclear power is that I'm extremely scared of climate change, that I'm extremely scared of a world without sufficient energy, and nuclear energy can go some way, by no means the whole way, towards making those issues better, but that's all because of its effect on people. And it's an industry which has oversold the technology in exactly the same way as the advocates of the renewables are doing today. I debated with a Green member of the German Parliament, and the debate was almost closed down from the start when she said, well, we've got 2 reports that show that renewables can answer all of the questions. Well, frankly, I've got a lot of reports from the 1950s saying exactly the same about nuclear energy. And I don't believe either of them. There's also a broad change in many developed countries anyway of just less respect for politicians and for the industries than was the case when nuclear energy began to develop. And so you have got some very sophisticated anti-nuclear movements in Europe and North America. This was during attempts to find a radioactive waste site in the UK in the mid-1980s. I like the one on the left. You won't be able to read it, but it says meat counter and vegetable counter that way and Geiger counter that way. Very effective here. This was Lincolnshire against nuclear dumping, but people were just asked to come and pin pictures of their children to the board down there. Devastating public relations work there against the industry that for some reason thought it was a good idea to take full-page adverts out saying radioactive waste isn't terribly dangerous, you know. I don't know if you flew. I'm flying home with Air New Zealand tomorrow. I've never seen an Air New Zealand advert saying, fly Air New Zealand, if you get one of our planes, it's very unlikely the wings are going to drop off because we do all of these tests on them, which is in effect what the nuclear industry was regarded as good PR. And there are protests in this part of the world, but my feeling is that the protest movement is really beginning to grow and find its feet in much of Asia Pacific. And my suspicion is that post-Fukushima we'll see much more of that. That's actually no bad thing, because leaving industry totally to its own devices I don't think works particularly. But a number of countries have also then found that the Greens are just as untrustworthy and unreliable as the industry was. And you then get to a synthesis where the tension between the two can actually lead to much better decision making than you get if you leave all decisions to technical and economic institutions, or if you leave all decisions to green campaigners. A variety of political responses, very anti in the case of some countries, Japan and Germany most obviously, others seeming to be, well, it hasn't really got much to do with us, we'll do a few tests, but it doesn't really change the overall argument. Just to finish, I think there's 2 things that are important when you're communicating an emergency, and I think these are lessons for all people who are in this field. One is obviously you are trying to guide actions in real time. You're giving information so people will know what to do. That includes the people on the site, it includes the emergency services, it includes us as individuals. But also, the way that those institutions communicate during the emergency will have an effect for years, if not for decades, on the way they are viewed. I have enormous respect for the courage and the effectiveness of the way the Japanese responded to quite unprecedented circumstances around Fukushima, but I think there are lessons to be learned, because my feeling is that there was very little focus and understanding of the second of those 2 requirements. The International Nuclear Events Scale, which was put together over Chernobyl, is just an example of that. The definitions are a problem, because actually when you read these, there isn't that much difference between a level 5, a level 6 and a level 7. They're supposed to be one is supposed to be 10 times worse than the level below it. For example, level 5 includes several deaths from radiation. Well, there have been no deaths from radiation as a result of Fukushima, nor in my view is it likely that we ever will have detectable off-site health consequences of any description. So you can say, well, this isn't level 5 because it doesn't fulfill that, or you can certainly argue that it is level 7, or actually 3 separate level 7 events. The point of the INES was to provide prompt information to help people understand what was going on. The way it was actually used was that we had to wait about 2 weeks to get a statement that was completely and utterly misleading. And I think the whole thing needs to be looked at in those terms. My observation, having been involved in the media, was that on the first day, when things didn't go really severely wrong, this was the 6th day of the 6th, 7th day of the accident, was the day when the Japanese chose to tell us that it was a level 5 rather than a level 4. 2 weeks after things had settled down and a lot of progress has been made was the moment that the decision was made to raise it from a level 5 to a level 7. In effect, I think information was being regarded as an academic exercise. You wait until you are ready to say with a reasonable degree of certainty, this is what was happening a couple of weeks ago. That's not, and as an academic, that's what I do most of the time. When I publish stuff, I check that it's more, at least arguable, and the contribution, and that it doesn't contain silly mistakes. You can't do that in an emergency. People aren't wanting to know what happened 2 weeks ago. And I think you need to spend far more time saying, this is what might happen during the next week. We're going to be wrong on some of this because we haven't got perfect information. But at least by doing that, you will give the true impression, I hope, that you are trying to be open and honest about everything that you know and the areas you don't know, rather than the impression that was given that things were being kept close to the chest until the evidence could be given. So I won't skip particularly through, I won't do any of this. These slides are quite interesting, they are available in the pack. Is comparing the actual levels of radioactivity in Tokyo, where the Great Panic was, indeed over here. The highest level recorded there was significantly lower than some of the background levels that you find in Hong Kong. The biggest level in the world, an Iranian resort at Ramsar, you actually pick up 250 millisieverts per year, which is the legal limit for the people working on the Fukushima site during the emergency. That's a health resort. People flock to Ramsar because of the health benefits that are told for that town, which doesn't really fit in with the argument that this is a patent and huge threat to health. I think we do need a perspective. I understand something like 1,200 early deaths in Hong Kong per year because of the effects of air quality. It's against that sort of background that we need to judge what's happening here. My suspicion is that those who were evacuated from the southwestern part of the evacuation zone around Fukushima, if they went to Tokyo, will have probably measurably shortened their life, because avoiding a tiny, tiny risk associated with radiation, but swapping it for the very real and measurable risk of city air. And Tokyo is one of the cleanest major cities in the world. I don't want to take longer because we do want to have time for chats, but I would say developing trust is really at the heart of the matter. It's not just imparting information. Information comes a long way down people's sense of being properly looked after. The communication in emergency has to be proactive and predictive, not reactive and backward-looking. And we need to bear in mind that actually the public's a lot more rational than technicians are. Technicians believe that if you tell people we've made this a bit safer, people will be a bit less worried about it. How irrational can you get? If people tell you we've made this a bit safer, you're giving the message this is a bit more dangerous than we thought it was, and you ought to be a bit more worried. That's how people respond. And until the industry starts reacting as rationally as the rest of us do, then I think it's likely to continue to run into some sort of difficulties. Anyway, that's broadly what I want to say. We do have two other contributors to this session. We have Professor Lee, who I think has managed to join us, yeah, and David Wong. So Professor Lee, could I perhaps ask you to take the stage?